In February 2021, I got my first glimpse into the world of custom mechanical keyboards by lubing my Redragon K582. That was my first time ever lubing switches and just getting more in depth with mechanical keyboards in general. Since June, I've been gathering components to build my own custom mechanical keyboard, and in this video we'll go over the process of building that keyboard. First, let's talk about components. For the case, I chose the KBD Fans Tofu65 in the E-white color. I actually got a bundle where the PCB and plate are included with the Tofu65. I just got a standard aluminum plate and a hot swap PCB. The switches are banana splits by the Key.Dot company, and these switches are not widely available. So it took me quite a while to get my hands on these, but I got them and here they are. Since I'm building a 65% keyboard, I got 3 packs, each pack containing 25 switches for a total of 75. For lubing, I got actual supplies to make the process easier than last time. As you can see, I have a keycap puller, a stem holder, a brush, a switch puller, and most importantly, a switch opener. Using a switch opener definitely beats using 2 small screwdrivers to open every switch like with the K582. In addition to lubing, I also filmed the switches, and here's the film that I used from Dusk. The lube that I used for the switches as well as the stabilizer housings is Krytox 205 grade 0, and for the stabilizer wires I used dielectric grease. Speaking of stabilizers, I used Dusk V2 screw-ins as opposed to the stabilizers that came with the Tofu65 bundle. And these are the keycaps I used. These are GMK white on black keycaps from Drop. Now it's time to open up all the switches and separate them into components before lubing. This was my first time ever using a switch opener, so you can see I was struggling a little bit, but eventually I got it open. The switch is now broken into its 4 main components: the top housing, bottom housing, stem, and spring, which I organized into 4 different coffee filters. Now it's time to repeat that process for all 75 switches, but I only show 25 here. Now for everyone's favorite part of modding a keyboard, lubing. I put a minimum amount of Krytox onto the brush and then took off any excess by brushing it off at the top of the Krytox container. I didn't really show it well here, but I started by brushing the 2 rails of the lower housing, then I moved on to lubing the rest of the lower housing. Then I moved on to lubing the spring, and no, I don't bag lube my springs. I like to lube my springs individually, so I applied a pretty generous amount of Krytox to the end of this spring. Then I put the end of that spring into the bottom housing. Of course I forgot to film the switch, and I only realized that after I put the switch back together. Then I applied that same generous amount of Krytox to the top of the spring. Then I put a stem onto a stem holder. I started by brushing the points where the stem contacts the leaf of the lower housing, and then I worked my way around the stem. Before I had the stem holder, lubing the stems would be the messiest part of lubing switches. I like the stem holder because overall it makes the process of lubing switches a lot cleaner. Then I moved on to lubing the top housing. I don't take any new lube to lube the top housing, and I don't even think it's a necessity. I like to lube the top housing to remove any excess lube from the brush so I can have a clean brush for the next switch. And now we have a lubed switch, but guess what? I forgot to film the switch. Now we gotta take the switch apart, and putting a piece of film on is usually a bit tedious. I think films are definitely worth it though, because they reduce stem wobble, improve the overall typing feel, and it only costs like $5 for a pack of 120. Now we just need to put the switch back together, and now we have a nicely upgraded banana split. Now we gotta repeat that process for another 67 switches, because there are 68 switches on the Tofu65. And in this time lapse, I only show myself lubing another 6 switches. Also, it's commonly said that the key to good lubing is to be consistent with every switch. Admittedly, I wasn't very consistent with every switch, but I'll get better the more switches I lube. 61 switches later, here we are. Now it's time to lube the stabilizers. I decided to use Durox stabilizers instead of the stabilizers that come with the Tofu65 because the Durox stabilizers are higher quality. I forgot what they're officially referred to as, but we'll be using 3 of the smaller stabilizers and 1 large stabilizer for the Spacebar. I started by taking a stabilizer housing and applying a light amount of Krytox to one of the inside walls of the housing, then I worked my way around the inside of the housing. Then I took a stabilizer stem. My principle with lubing stabilizer stems is similar to the top housings of switches. I don't think it's a necessity to lube them, but it's nice to do it to get all the excess lube off of the brush. Then I took a stabilizer wire. I covered one end of the wire with a pretty generous amount of dielectric grease. Then I evened out the application of dielectric grease by brushing it to spread it evenly at the end of the stabilizer wire, and I also made sure to get some dielectric grease on the main part of the stabilizer wire. Before lubing the other end of the stabilizer wire, I assembled one of the stabilizer housings and stems together. Then I put the lubed end into the stabilizer housing and snapped it in. I repeated the same process with the other end of the stabilizer, and now we have a nicely lubed stabilizer. Before lubing any of the other stabilizers, I wanted to put the stabilizer in the PCB to make sure that it actually worked well. This was my first time ever using screw-in stabilizers, and for some reason, for the life of me, I could not install them properly, and I couldn't find a video on how to properly install them either. Like you can see, I tried to install it on top of the plate, and I didn't even realize you had to screw it in from the bottom. I didn't know which way you had to screw it in, so it took a lot of trial and error. I eventually figured out how to install it, but my problem was that I didn't know one end of the housing actually had to snap into the PCB. As a result of that, the stabilizer was at an angle while the switch was straight, and that causes this to happen. At that point, I came up with the conclusion that the stabilizers were not compatible with the PCB, which was incorrect because they are. I decided to test out the stabilizers that came with the Tofu65 to see if they would actually work with the PCB, and they did. Unsurprisingly, of course, because they were easier to snap in, and that's when I realized that you even had to snap them in the first place. It sounded atrocious though, but hey, it was progress. Then I tried the Durox stabilizer again, but I actually snapped it in that time, and now that I knew the Durox stabilizers were good, I finished lubing them and I put them into the PCB. Now that the stabilizers are secured onto the PCB, I put the plate on top. Since this is a hot swap PCB, I put the switches right in. Then I added case foam. For foam, I literally used the protective packaging that the case came in. It's not like this is high quality foam or anything, but I'm using this for dampening, so I don't really see the reason for spending $20 on a piece of foam. I cut the foam out in the shape of the case, and I also cut holes where the screw holes are on the case. I originally wanted to O-ring mod my case, and that does not mean putting O-rings on all the switches. That means putting O-rings on the screw holes, standoffs, whatever you want to call it. I think they're called standoffs, I don't know. Then putting down the PCB on top of that, and then putting another O-ring on top of that before screwing it down. So what you're doing is basically sandwiching the PCB between two O-rings with every screw. For about 15 minutes I attempted to do the O-ring mod, but then I realized that my O-rings were actually too wide and they couldn't fit on top of the screw holes. So I scrapped the idea of the O-ring mod, and then I just decided to put the PCB straight into the case. The problem was I found it extremely difficult to attach the PCB with the plate already on. So I took all the switches out, mounted the PCB to the case, put the plate on top of the PCB, and then put the switches back on. I'm not even kidding, it took me like 30 to 45 minutes to put the switches back in. It is so much harder to do when the plate is already in the case. Especially the switches in the corners, those are the most difficult to do. But after all that time, I finally got it. Before putting the keycaps on, I wanted to make sure that all the keys registered, so I brought my keyboard over to the computer and then I used a key register test. About 15 of the keys didn't register, so I took the switches that didn't work out, and then I noticed that the pins were just bent. Some of them were so bent, it was like ridiculous. And I thought I was being gentle when I was putting the switches in, but apparently not. I used a switch puller to try my best to bend some of the pins back into shape, and a lot of them were successful. 6 switches had pins that were bent beyond repair. You know how many extra switches I had? 7. So I opened and lubed those 6 switches that I needed. Once everything was sorted out, here's the finished product, and yes, I know my B and V keys are flipped, I'll fix that. Before we set up the software for the keyboard, let's peel off the plastic on the back and attach the rubber feet. Now we're ready to set up the software. I use the software VIA, which is quite commonly used with custom keyboards. VIA has its own key register test, and you can also assign macros, remap keys, and map functions. Even though this is a 65% keyboard, you're not losing functionality because you have layers, and VIA is really good with layers. I'm not going to go into too much detail with the layers, but usually I use the second layer, which is called layer 1, to control the RGB and use the function keys. There are 4 keys on the right side of the keyboard that you can literally do whatever you want with. The most common thing to do with those keys is to map out some keys that are between the number pad and main keyboard on a regular 100% keyboard, like page up, page down, home, print screen, delete. I'm sure no one uses every single one of those keys on a regular basis. Out of those keys, the most common that I use are delete, pause, print screen, and scroll lock, which is exactly what I mapped those keys out to be. Before I get into my final thoughts about the keyboard, here's a quick sound test. I've been using this keyboard for about a week now, and I don't have any complaints honestly. It's a really nice keyboard. Typing on this board is insanely smooth. It's way smoother than what I'm used to. The board also feels really high quality when you're using it, meaning everything combined, like the aluminum case, GMK keycaps, banana splits. This is my first time using a 65% keyboard, and I'm really liking it. I like the smaller design. And this doesn't lose functionality. This has the exact same features my previous board had, if not more. Actually, definitely more. Building this keyboard actually gave more challenges than I thought it would give. Yeah, I know I'm technically a beginner, and then I hear YouTubers say, oh, I wish I had like the NK65 entry edition when I was a beginner, which I guess implies building their first custom keyboard wasn't completely smooth either. But the challenges I had when building this board weren't really the challenges I was expecting, like figuring out how to install the stabilizers, trying to install the switches onto the plate when it's already in the case. I did not consider those as possible problems before building the keyboard whatsoever. Switch pins bending, yeah, I knew that was a problem, but I didn't really expect it to happen on that great of a scale. Building the keyboard overall was a fun experience. Of course there were frustrations and complications, but overall it was fun. It was also a nice learning experience. The next time I build a custom mechanical keyboard, I have no clue when that's gonna be. I'll be able to do it better. And the end result of the building process was definitely worth it. So there you go, my first custom mechanical keyboard. It's been a journey to build, and here we are. That's gonna be the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.